Okay, welcome back. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about perfect squares and square roots. So what is a perfect square? Well, the perfect square comes from the Greeks way back when, where they would take some squares as dots. So we would do something like this. And this would represent 2 squared, right? Because it's 2 by 2, right? So we'd say 2 squared. Or if we had this square, okay? And so this would represent 3 squared, right? It's a square of dots where it's 3 on one side, 3 on the other, right? And then of course, if we have 4 squared, we have something similar. Okay, and so this would be represent 4 squared. Okay, and so that's where we get this idea of 3 squared, 4 squared, 16 squared. Okay, now so a perfect square. So this is what we represent by perfect squares. So a perfect square is any number that is multiplied by itself twice, right? That gives us what we call a perfect square. Okay, so by definition, when we say, hey, this number is a perfect square, well, it means that, hey, we can make that number by multiplying a number by itself, some other number, right? So what do we get? We get 9 and we get 16. So guess what? 4, 9, and 16 are what we call perfect squares, because we can find a number multiplied by itself to get that number. Okay, so this is a perfect square. 9 is a perfect square because there exists a number multiplied by itself to get 9, which is 3. 16 is a perfect square. Why? Because there exists a number that we can multiply by itself to get 16. That number is 4. So there are lots of perfect squares, right? So there are 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, 121, 144, 169, right? Those are all perfect squares. The first perfect squares, well, 1, right? 1 times 1 is 1, okay? So these are all the perfect squares from 1 through 13. Okay, now, that brings up the idea of square root. What is a square root? Well, think of what we just talked about with squares. And think about the word root. You know, we use that word lots of different ways, but think of a root as in like the base of a plant, right? It's the foundation where everything else above the ground comes from. It comes from the root, right? Or if you talk about root causes of something, right? So the square root is related to perfect squares, okay? So what is a square root? It's a number that, if we multiply that number by itself, gives us another number, right? So if we want the square root of a number, we want to find that number, which if we square it, will give us the number that's given. So again, that might be a mouthful, but let me show you. So if I want the square root, and the symbol for a square root is that, okay, this is what we call the radicand, or excuse me, not the radicand, the radical, right? This is the radical sign. What goes underneath is what we call the radicand. So let's say 64. Okay, so let's read this. This is saying the square root of 64, meaning we want to find a number such that when we square that number, it will give us 64. And that is the square root. So what number, when we square it, will give us 64? And that's 8. So the square root of 64 is 8. That's what we mean. So if we want the square root of 144, then we want the number, when that number is squared, will give us 144. And what is that? That's 12. Or if we say, hey, I want the square root of 169, then I want the number squared, whatever that number is squared, that will give me 169, and that will be 13. Okay? And so if we want to do, for example, if I want the square root of 1,296, well, we want to know what number squared will give us 1,296, and that number is 36. Okay? Or if we do 1024, right? If I want the square root of 1024, well, I want to know what number squared is going to give me 1,024. Okay? And that number is what? $32. Okay? And that's it. Now we'll do some examples. Take care.